Hello everyone, and welcome to my hopefully short presentation on the 10 generations of higher education. I hope you enjoyed this reading as much as I do. This is one of my favorites, and that is because it sort of sets the landscape for why we do what we do in higher education. By knowing how we got here helps us a lot to answer the questions of why we do what we do. So the first generation was the Reformation. Basically, what this was is it was to train ministers for the ministry. And examples of this are Harvard, Yale, and William and Mary. Generation 2 was the start of the colonial colleges. You notice this was right prior to the American Revolution. And it's also during, I believe it's the Second Enlightenment. So not only are the teachings about, they're studying a lot of Greek and Latin and the Bible, but also they're introducing the philosophies of John Locke and Isaac Newton. At this point, the tutors who are teaching these young men at this point to prepare for the ministry are a transient population. They move in and out. It's sort of a train the trainer where they get them in, have them go through college, and then they come back and train new ministers. But at this point, we start to see faculty that hang around for a little bit more and become more permanent. Examples of this are Princeton, Dartmouth, and the College of Philadelphia. So in Generation 3, we see the Republican education. Now notice how one of the things I want you to think about is how American higher education came along at the same time that we were building America, and the two really go hand in hand together. So we're sort of moving away from religion, and we become much more focused on patriotism, and not so much on creating ministers, but on creating leaders of the new republic. And at this point, lots of states began to create state-run colleges. It's interesting to note that less than 1% of the male population attended college during this era. And we're talking about 50 students or 200 students. This is a very small population. In Generation 4, we sort of see the passing of Republican education. And it's during this time that people start to say, okay, we've got these colleges. What are we doing with them? We're not always training new ministers. What is it that we're trying to do? Who are we training? And for what purpose? And so because of that, and students started to ask about these questions too. As you know, once you start to gain some knowledge, you start to ask questions, and that's what these students did, and they started to rebel, and they had lots of things that they wanted where that the faculty weren't so much able to give them. And because of that, there was a lot of strife at this time. And then they started to say, you know what, maybe we should have some admission requirements here, and perhaps we should go back to the liberal arts and classical languages. Maybe if we focused on Greek and Latin again, these students wouldn't be as upset. So think about this, how have classical languages influenced college education, and what happens when they are eliminated in colleges? You'll see this later on in the other generations. And so examples of this time, now there started to be smaller colleges who wanted to specifically still focus on ministry. And so that included colleges like Bowdoin, South Carolina, and Andover Theological Seminary. So in Generation 5, the classical denominational colleges started to appear. And the Yale report, I believe it's 1828, came out that said, here's what we believe the purpose of a superior education is about. It's about disciplining the mind and not the furniture. I thought that was a really interesting way to say that furniture is about content and not about critical thinking skills. It's just a really interesting dichotomy that the Yale report came out with. So there were an increasing number of small private colleges, and around this time, student life became much more engaged. They started to think of the student more holistically at this point. And at this time, Oberlin College was the first to admit women. So examples of these types of colleges are Colby and George Washington. So in Generation 6, the multi-purpose colleges started to come about. And what that means is these colleges served lots of different purposes and lots of different people, and they expanded west. There's a real difference between the East Coast colleges and the West Coast colleges because the populations were very different. The Land Grant Act came along and was able to produce much more funding for these colleges that would have agriculture and industrial arts at its institutions. And then at this point, the creation of a university, what the definition of that is, finally became more visible. So the creation of a university meant full-time faculty, professional education that required a bachelor's degree, perhaps some graduate school, and there were small colleges and schools embedded within the university. So we didn't have to keep popping up with these standalone institutions. We could create them within a larger structure. So in Generation 7, there was a lot of growth in standardization because here we've got all of these colleges and universities all over the United States kind of doing their own thing. And so it got really difficult to sort of standardize this. And especially as these larger institutions were now averaging a few thousand students, it became even more important to standardize this. So they started to standardize the admission requirement, what a credit hour looks like, what some disciplines were like, dentistry, engineering, art, music, and then the idea of a collegiate ideal, which is basically the student experience and instruction. So what holistically do we want the student to come out with their college degree? At this point, they started creating accrediting bodies for different things, and at this time it was the Association of American Universities. Accreditation is huge across institutions today. Just in the USM School of Education and Human Development, I believe we have 5 different accrediting bodies that we have to answer to. So examples of these schools were Carnegie and the Gorham Normal School, which is a predecessor of USM. And so in Generation 8, there started to be hierarchical differentiation of schools. Teachers' colleges replaced normal schools. There were different levels of criteria for the collegiate ideal, advancing knowledge. And then based on these criteria, selective admissions began to get very discriminatory. So think about it. What do you think might be some selective admission criteria? Even today, believe it or not, you know, for everything that we have, we can still be pretty selective in who we admit. And by the way, this photo in the upper right is the rhinoceros at USM, and this was a fixture on the campus until actually just last month when it finally deteriorated and we have a new art structure there. But remember when we were talking about the campus saga, USM, it is the rhinoceros. So Generation 9 sees the academic revolution. So right after World War II with the GI Bill, young men were just pouring into institutions to try to get a college education. And then along this time in the late 60s and 70s, the space race was going on. You know, Sputnik had gotten out there in space, and darn it, if we weren't gonna be close behind, if not surpass them. The whole getting a man on the moon was huge during this time. And so because of that, the academic sciences started pouring in funding for graduate education because we needed the astronauts. We needed the trained scientists to be able to get us on the moon. Also along this time was the student movement based on the freedom of speech was huge. In earlier generations, the whole idea of colleges and the faculty on these colleges was with the idea of what we called in parentis loco, which means in place of parents. So when you went away to college, the faculty were your parents. You know, they took care of you. And this started to go away in the 60s by allowing college students more freedom. Because of that, that created a lot of riots and tension, and it was also because of what was going on in the world at that time, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War. And at this point in history, the Gorham State Teachers College joins the University of Maine, Portland, and then ended up creating the University of Southern Maine because we needed to expand our education. So Generation 10 was a generation of regulation and funding. Believe it or not, prior to this time, there really wasn't financial aid unless it was private. So at this time, Pell Grants, aka free money, allowed the neediest students the opportunity to attend college. There was also Title IX that came about. And at this point, students were asking for more relevance in their studies to succeed in the world. So it wasn't all about classical language and critical thinking skills and whatnot. They wanted to know how their college education relates to the career that they are going to have. So I just wanted to give you a short history of USM and how it really matches not all 10 generations, but the last 5 generations of higher ed. It's really interesting to sort of see the big picture and then bring it down and look at one institution. So the Gorham Normal School was established in 1878 specifically to create teachers. It was a one-year program. And then sort of parallel to them, Portland University was created in the early 1920s. And so Portland Junior College is sort of going along, doing its thing, very separate, and then, 10, 12 miles away, here's Gorham, sort of still producing its teachers, and now it is a full 4-year program, and in the late 40s they become the Gorham State Teachers College. So then along in the 40s, Portland University is given the right to do a law degree. So the Portland University is starting to do a lot of the professional degrees, the business degree, the law degree, and out in Gorham they're still producing teachers. And then at some point in the 60s, they merged together. And at that point, it's sort of what we call POGO. I don't know if you've ever heard that, which is the University of Maine at Portland Gorham. And then in the late 70s, it then became the University of Southern Maine. And then in the late 80s, Lewiston Auburn joined us. So that's kind of an interesting timeline of USM and how it relates to the 10 generations. So when we look at Generation 11, what do you believe would be the characteristics, and how do you see higher education changing in the future? I look forward to hearing your answers on the discussion board.